that is Professor Stephen Friedman, who will talk to us through some of the issues that were raised. Now, let me start with this one. As I was talking to you when we were listening to the president, he alluded to the fact that we must leave the ANC that is united as we have found it. Now, when he talks about the branches having to consider some issues that would have a unifying electoral outcome, we discussed the issue of leadership and the runner-up. What is your view about what he's suggesting regarding changing the constitution of the ANC?
Colin, it became clear at this conference that although it was widely expected that the ANC was going to go to the elective conference at the end of the year, that there'd be a massive battle between the two candidates and their factions, there is now a very serious attempt to prevent that happening. There's a very serious attempt to cobble out some sort of compromise so that the ANC is not torn apart. And the reason for that, quite simply, is that a lot of people within the ANC on both sides believe that if you go to that conference and one side just beats the other, then the ANC will split again. And the ANC would be very unlikely to win the next election if it splits again. Yeah, you were talking about the issue of perennial factionalism, and when he talked about the branches having to consider this issue, you had the response. Did you get the impression that it was a mixed reaction? Yes, it is a mixed reaction, because you see, the point is that there's an attempt to work out this compromise. But is the compromise acceptable to both sides? Is the compromise acceptable to the membership? Let's take this example you mentioned, this idea that the loser should be the deputy president. Is that going to be seen by ANC delegates as an attempt to create unity? Or is it going to be seen by quite a lot of ANC delegates as a sign that the faction which is losing wants to hang on to the deputy presidency because they won't get the presidency? So there's a lot of work they're going to have to do if they want to achieve that unity, because you're entirely correct. It's one thing to talk about changing the constitution, but if your delegates at the conference are still divided into factions, then you have a lot of work to do if you're going to try and achieve that.
There was the issue of what happens to number 3.
Well, that is also the issue. You see, people have been making the point. If you only have 2 candidates, it works. If you have 3 candidates, what do? I suppose one thing you can say is, well, the 3rd candidate then drops off. But then that creates all the factional problems you were talking about. So one really wonders whether this is the solution. I mean, the solution really is for the 2 factions to get together and hammer out some sort of compromise if unity is what they want. What we then need to ask is, if they achieve that unity, is that going to be acceptable to voters in 2019, because that's not necessarily so.
But then when we take a bird's eye view of this conference, how is the ANC coming out of it? Do we see a united ANC? Do you see some perspectives being sharpened in going forward? Because when the president is talking about the issue of the ANC being weak at implementation and reviewing, monitoring and evaluation. I was telling you earlier that, but we heard monitoring and evaluation during the likes of the late Collins Chabani, as well as former Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, and that didn't work out. Hence, that's where we are here now, because of how the National Development Plan didn't work out as expected.
You see, the answer to that will be, it's a very good point, but the answer to that will be, well, Manuel Shabane and now Jeff Khadebe are there in government. They're not in the ANC. This will be an ANC structure. It'll be a Luthuli House structure, and that will make it easier to achieve that. But one has to ask questions about that, because the reason monitoring and evaluation hasn't been successful is that government departments usually see it as a police force, so they try to avoid it. Now, if that's the case with government departments, if it's sitting in the presidency, does it mean that if you move it to Luthuli House, that changes that? And you've also got to ask the other obvious question, which is, what are you monitoring? Because the ANC might be the governing party, but the government serves all of South Africa. The government is for all South Africans. So you must be very careful not to confuse the ANC with the government. The ANC may be the governing party, but there are still many South Africans who are not ANC members who the government serves. So that is a danger of trying to concentrate implementation in the ANC headquarters instead of in government.
Right. So we talked about how the ANC is coming out of this conference. Let's mention the second aspect now. Is the organization really genuinely admitting its credibility deficit in as far as the perceptions of the ANC regarding the challenges that they have Spanning from last year during the local government elections, you know what happened with the metros, and going forward, the way the ANC is perceived now in terms of, number one, its leadership and how it's performing in government, and the state of the economy, given that we are in, you know, a technical recession, the issue of being in a junk status. For somebody who's looking at the ANC now and saying, should I give the ANC a chance? Or are we having some electoral implications come 2018? We're going to have a different playing ground as far as choices are concerned for members of the public.
Look, the reality, as we know, is that there are a lot of voters who did support the ANC in the past who are unhappy, who probably stayed at home in the last local government elections. Your question is obviously, how will they react? My sense is that as we talk this afternoon, their mind is not going to be changed. They're not going to be any happier with the ANC than they were. Because what has actually come out of this, what they were concerned about in the main, I mean, different people were concerned about different things, but in the main, people were concerned that the ANC was too concerned about itself. It wasn't concerned about citizens enough. It wasn't serving people effectively. There was too much corruption, etc. Now, nothing that's come out of the conference has really dealt with that. Yes, there have been some proposals, but I think a lot of voters will look at this and say, look, they're still talking about themselves, they're not talking about me. What will change that is that if some of these decisions which have been taken are actually implemented effectively between now and the next election, if they're able to show that they are serious about corruption, if they're able to show that they are serious about serving voters instead of serving themselves, then they could change that around. But right now, I think the perception will be that they spent a week talking about themselves and each other, and they didn't spend enough time talking about voters.
But you know, as you and I are talking now, when we have to bring the ANC's policy conference closer to home, there are people who are living in municipalities, and the president talked about service delivery protests that even though people are damaging properties, burning libraries and so forth, we shouldn't actually just leave it at that. People who do that must be punished. The law must take its course. But the ANC must consider that there's a voice of the people that is saying, we are not happy with service delivery at local government, and the ANC needs to do something about that. What do you make out of that statement?
No, I think it's a very important issue, but I mean, some of us have been arguing, I've been arguing for me, that the only way you can change that is that you have to listen more effectively. You know, it's no good just putting a few more technical people in local government if they're not listening to what voters are saying. So that gets back to what I was saying earlier. What came out of this conference to show that the ANC is now going to listen to voters on the ground, particularly voters in underserved areas, townships, shack settlements? Is the ANC going to go out there and actually listen carefully to what people there want and try to give it to them? Because if that doesn't happen, then the dissatisfaction continues.
Okay, let's talk about what's happening in the periphery now. Something of great concern. Since Friday, we've been having offices of some key leaders in provinces. The office of Gauteng Premier David Makula being burned, the office in the Eastern Cape also of the Premier there being burned. And today we hear of the offices of the Hawks having experienced a break-in and some computers being taken there. What do you make out of this? Is there something that we should suspect?
Well, obviously we must be worried about this. I mean, it indicates that some people are trying to fight political battles violently. I mean, this is not the first incident. We had the break-in at the Chief Justice's offices. This has become a worrying trend. And I think what we need to look for is as you said earlier, in relation to other sorts of violence. The real test is, are the people who did this going to be caught, and is it going to be stopped? Because if this continues, we're in a very worrying situation in this country, because then you're in a situation where you start worrying that people in public office, if somebody doesn't like them, are going to be subject to illegal and violent behavior. So there's a very important challenge for the police here to actually sort this out.
Let's talk about the issue that has been on the lips of most people when they talk about the leaked emails and the Gupta family saga. What do you make out of this? Because the policy conference is one thing, but as they disperse now out of Nasrec, going back to government, they're going to work, nothing wouldn't have changed in as far as the status quo is concerned regarding the state of SOEs, the issue of sentiments and business confidence, and South Africa having to create a platform where we attract FDI as much as possible so that we can get out of the current technical recession and a build up towards how the country gets itself out of junk status rating by ratings agencies. Now, how would you suggest that the ANC go forward in as far as that is concerned?
Well, if the ANC wants to deal with this issue, it has got to tackle this question of state capture, in the sense that citizens have to be sure that the decisions government takes are taken because that's what government thinks that voters want, not what rich people want. It has to be clear that decisions taken in the public enterprises, the state-owned enterprises, which are crucial to this, are there to serve South Africans and are not there to serve special interests. So there's a tremendous task there. What is happening within the ANC and with government on this at the moment is what I call trench warfare. There's a battle about there's a battle about Eskom at the moment. There could be a battle against about Denel, about Telkom, etc. I mean, the SABC itself has been subject to a battle. I think what is signalled at this stage is that those battles will continue. Right now, the momentum seems to be with the, if you like, the anti-state capture group, because you've had people who were not in that position beforehand coming out and saying, look, this state capture is acceptable. But obviously the other group is going to fight back. So I think what we're looking at for the next few months is once again a battle. What does seem to be becoming very interesting is that the new Minister of Finance, Mr. Gigaba, although that was widely speculated that he would be closer to the state capture group, is finding himself in a position where he's having to take a very firm stance against them. And making clear that we need to signal to South Africans and to the world that public finance in South Africa is for the people of South Africa.
Okay.
And that may be very important going forward.
Okay, what we have seen now is something of a development, step by step. If the ANC get into a national policy conference and reflect honestly and debate robustly the challenges that are overwhelming the organization, going forward, what should change in terms of the cadres who have been deployed to different and various government departments and SOEs and so forth? And what should happen regarding cautionary elements that have to do with a build-up towards the national elections? Because when you talk to other analysts, I haven't asked you before about what your viewpoint is, how the elections will play out in 2018, given that we have an ANC that is talking about a succession debate. And you're talking about Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as well as Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, going forward, how would the organization then approach this so that we don't find ourselves debating whether or not the ANC is going to struggle to get a two-thirds majority, or we're going to have impetus for opposition parties to gain momentum and have more power and unity in parliament so that they can deal with issues of debate and voting?
Well, I think there are two things here. The first one is between now and the end of this year, one has to be quite frank about it, you're not going to see massive change. And the reason you're not going to see massive change is that this battle is going to continue. We must always remember that the ANC policy conference doesn't actually take decisions. It sets the agenda for the end of the year conference, and that's all they've done here. If you were listening to the President's talk, there are quite clearly issues here, big issues, which are not settled yet and are going to have to be settled there. Going forward from there, what the ANC's prospects in 2019 are going to depend very much on what it does in 2018 and the first half of 2019. Because whoever wins the ANC presidency at the end of this year is going to have to spend 2018 persuading a lot of voters who dumped the ANC in 2016 that they should return. And if that president fails to do that, then we're looking at the very likely prospect of no party getting 50% in the 2019 election. So whether it's Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa or somebody else, that person is going to have to work with the leadership team to convince South Africans who are unhappy with the ANC that they should return. And that is going to be really the test of what happens in 2019.
What do you make of somebody who is standing outside, say, for example, the perspective of opposition parties who are looking forward to punch holes in the achievements of the ANC as they come out of this conference? Well,
the interesting reality of our politics is that although opposition parties have benefited from the changes within the ANC and from the changes in the election results, the story of South African elections is still the story of the ANC. And that is because, as I said earlier, the people who stayed at home in the last elections didn't cross to the EFF or the DA. They are still potential ANC voters. So it's less a question of what the opposition does in the next year, it's a question of what the ANC does.